Thank you for that very warm welcome. Along with the Royal Society of Tasmania, I would also like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting wherever we find ourselves today, recognising that these lands are yet to be ceded. I would also like to pay respects to any Indigenous peoples who are joining us here today also. When I was preparing this particular lecture, I found myself in a situation where there is just so much to share, and knowing how to try and synthesize that into a relatively short period of time was a particular challenge. As I reflected on what the key messages would be, what we can take away from our study of people in extreme environments like Antarctica, I was also given a moment to pause and reflect on the fact that, as Eric was saying a moment ago, I am privileged to engage in the study of people. And without the very generous participation of people who have lived and worked in Antarctica and their partners elsewhere in the world, we would not have benefited from this knowledge. So that interrelationship between people who are contributing their time, their knowledge and their experiences to people such as ourselves so that we can all benefit is something that I think, particularly at the moment when we think about the impacts of the pandemic and bringing people back together, is something that we should recognise, celebrate and appreciate. To provide a little bit of context, this term extreme and unusual environments, often shortened to EUEs. Fundamentally, these are environments that differ from routine environments, differ from the everyday environments that most people would experience most of the time, along 4 key parameters. Primarily, the one I focus on are the psychological parameters. And what that means is that the experience of the world around you, as well as your own internal world, and how that influences the way you think, feel, and behave, is quite fundamentally different. We talk about the specific differences as we move through this particular lecture, but it really is this psychological experience of extreme and unusual environments that has been consistently found to have the largest impact on people's health, well-being, and performance. And again, given the experiences of many around the world, particularly with periods of isolation, confinement associated with quarantining and other COVID risk mitigation strategies, I think people's understanding of why the psychology of extreme environments perhaps have the most impact has grown quite a bit. There are also social parameters to think about. In most circumstances, in extreme and unusual environments, people don't have any choice over who they're spending their time with, and often very limited control about how long, how frequently, and the nature of those interactions. It also often means being removed from pre-existing social support networks. So in other words, being taken away, or at least being physically distanced from people who you would normally rely on to feel connected, to feel supported. Now that links quite clearly into the psychology of extreme environments, because what we know is that positive social support networks is one of the strongest positive coping strategies that people can use. So I want you to sit with that just for a moment. That not only are you in an environment that's really not like your everyday environment, but the people you'd normally turn to aren't there with you. So thinking about how that might impact you from a psychological perspective. Now think about if you had the privilege, the opportunity, resources to connect with those people in some way, by phone, by internet as we are today, or even in years gone by, written letters or telegraphs. It's actually a bit of a double-edged sword. It has the opportunity to lift us, to motivate us, excite us, and help us feel connected. But at the same time, what occurs is that it reminds us that these people aren't next to us right now, that these people aren't simply in the next room. And then we have the consequences of that feeling of so near and yet so far. And again, we can see that relevance for some of the COVID pandemic experiences that people have undergone over the past few years. Now, physically, these environments, by and large, normally would not be able to easily sustain human life. So with Antarctica, for example, it's frequently cited as the coldest, highest, driest, and windiest continent on Earth. You're not able to survive in this environment without a range of food supplies, building equipment, and other technologies. Which brings us to the other component, the technological parameters. Now, generally speaking, in an EUE, an extreme and unusual environment, we tend to see a polarised shift here. Either there's almost complete reliance on technology in some form, whether that's for communication, whether that's for food growing, whether that's for heating, or on the other extreme end, it's an absence of technologies. So think, for example, in the immediate aftermath of a natural disaster. We frequently have disruptions to power, to connectivity, and so those individuals have access to limited technologies and much, much less than we would normally expect in our everyday lives. Now, there's a lot of debate about, well, how do you define an extreme and unusual environment? Does it have to have all four parameters? How bad do they have to be? Do they have to be there for a certain amount of time? Long story short, you don't need all four parameters to be fulfilled for an environment to be extreme. It's more about the degree of impact they have on the person and the community. Similarly, there's no minimum or maximum time that an environment needs to be in this state to be considered extreme. We do know about acute extreme and unusual environments. So again, in the immediate aftermath of things like natural disasters, that would be considered an acute extreme environment. And we also have chronic extreme environments. And that's things like Antarctica. It's things like space, where the fundamental parameters that make it extreme aren't changing anytime soon. And so, again, it could even be that some environments are at one point in time defined as extreme and unusual, and yet in other points of time are not. So Antarctica is one of those extreme and unusual environments that I've had the privilege to spend a lot of time focusing research on and working with people who have been in this space and after they return. It is perhaps one of the most extreme environments on Earth, and in fact has even been used as a space analogue, because some researchers argue that pretty much the closest you're going to get to space travel while staying on Earth. Antarctica holds amazing appeal, and that there are these amazing images that we conjure up when we think about this continent. And that's probably why we do see so many people apply to work in Antarctica as part of, for example, the Australian Antarctic Program. Something that makes Antarctica a bit more unique is that in addition to being an extreme and unusual environment, it is also an isolated and confined environment. And the pun is not lost on me. So it's both an EUE and an ice. Now, what makes an isolated and confined environment is that for reasons of physical safety, essentially survival, people have to live in capsulized areas. People could not survive in the Antarctic environment without shelter. They need to live within their quarters, particularly during the austral winter, where blizzards, snowstorms, and very low temperatures are much more frequent. And because you need to live inside, there's, if you like, a relatively confined space in which you're living, working, socialising, resting, and eating. It's all essentially happening in a very small space with the very same people you had no choice in being with for a very long time. So you can see those parallels, not just with what we've been doing for some time, i.e. comparing to space travel, but also people experiencing isolation and quarantine associated with the pandemic, where they're isolated, confined, unable to leave that environment for reasons of safety, actually mainly to others. Although it doesn't conjure up the most humane connotations, Antarctica is often also referred to as a natural laboratory for studying human behaviour. Like I said, doesn't sound all that respectable, but really what we're trying to say is that compared to an everyday environment where there's lots more opportunity for people to have different experiences, in Antarctica, pretty much every person has the same experiences at the same time in the same way. And so there's fewer what we call extraneous variables. There's fewer other things that could be changing their behaviour that we don't know about. So it allows us to make much stronger hypotheses around why a given behaviour is being demonstrated, why a particular outcome has been observed. And again, just to round off this bit of a discussion, if you like, around Antarctica and why it is an extreme and unusual environment, there is very limited social novelty. Now, what I would say is this is changing. With the advent of increased internet access, there is increased opportunity to engage with people outside the continent. But by and large, again, it's that issue of it's the same people, the same experiences day in, day out. So as you can imagine, there comes a point where you had a bit of, bit too much of people and you're looking for an opportunity to see someone new, experience something new. As I've already spoken about briefly, people in Antarctica are largely removed from their pre-existing support networks. In some relatively rare occasions, we do have partners who are wintering together, so they have that degree of social support, but it's not actually easier for those individuals like you might think, because what tends to happen is that the social pressures of not wanting to impact others, of essentially not wanting to rub it in that your partner is with you, means that these individuals spend very little time together. And in some ways, it's a harder experience because they can't be as free or flexible to express their connection with one another as they would in another environment. There's no separation between work and non-work spaces. The best that generally happens is that perhaps, you're working in the workshop and you come and eat in the common area, or you've been outside doing field work and you come and eat in the common area, or you congregate in some of the other communal areas. But there's not that sense of getting in the car or getting on the bus, getting on the ferry and having a time to, if you like, switch off, wind down, and clearly transition between work and non-work roles. You don't get to choose who comes down south with you. At the moment, the majority of Australian Antarctic programs, and actually national Antarctic programs around the world, continue to select individuals that they then place together rather than selecting teams. Now, that's a discussion that we probably won't get to today, but it's a really interesting thing to reflect on. When you have a group of highly performing, high achieving individuals, can we simply expect them to work effectively as a team? There's really, really limited privacy in Antarctica. During the summer, many people have to share their rooms because there's simply not the space. In the winter, it is common practice for people to have their own sleeping space, but the walls are pretty thin. You're not walking that far between, where you've just eaten and when you're sleeping. There's a lot of opportunity to be disrupted by others. And just like in any other work environment, the rumour mill is often at work. So secrets don't last in this space. Really interestingly, there is a very common experience of people having an altered sense of time. And what I mean by that is they can have periods of time they can't account for. So, for example, they'll lose chunks, hours of time, and genuinely can't tell you what they've been doing or what they were thinking about. And it's because of the altered cognitive state that comes from being a largely monotonous environment and the other cognitive demands that are placed on your brain simply to survive. So in other words, it kind of goes into a bit of automatic pilot. And if you don't need full attention on something, it almost goes into a little bit of a shutdown. At the same time, it can feel like time's dragging on, particularly during the austral winter, which is where there is very limited sunlight, if any at all, for months at a time. And that's when people will talk about having disrupted sleep patterns in particular, and that inability to tell you what day it is or how much longer there is until they return home. One thing that we found quite consistently in our research, and really probably hasn't been covered that much elsewhere, are the impacts of inconsistent workload. So in other words, there are periods of time where there are just not enough hours of the day to get everything done. And now that brings a certain type of pressure because you're constantly going, there's lots of demands on your brain, there's lots of demands on your emotion regulation, your way of interacting with others, your physical energy, contrasted with periods where there's actually not as much going on and there's a lot of downtime. And because what often happens is people oscillate between the two, almost too much work with very little work, it can be very hard to regulate energy levels. And so people will experience decrements in their well-being and performance because of this, if you like, all or nothing approach. These individuals have very limited control over their environment. They can't control the weather. They can't control whether the supply ship has been able to bring everything they need, particularly at the moment. And all of this is on top of it being an incredibly high risk environment. There is a reason that there is no native population in Antarctica. And that's because human life cannot be sustained without the aid of really complex technologies. Now, again, as I'm speaking, you'll be going, hang on a minute, there's a parallel there. Like for people who are quarantined, for people who are perhaps FIFO workers, people in space, people in remote oil rigs, this is all correct. And this is the beauty and the privilege of studying people in extreme and unusual environments. We've known for a really long time that there are lessons to be learned from these individuals that can benefit everybody, not just future Antarctic expeditioners. Big difference now is that the rest of the scientific community, the rest of the broader world community are also recognising these benefits. And we really are looking forward to taking this knowledge out and using it to benefit all. So considering how tricky this environment is, how risky it is, you can well imagine that a lot of the early work focused on the psychology of wellbeing and performance in Antarctica was about trying to pick the right people, pick people with the right stuff. And it's really, really interesting because there have been many, many studies in this regard. And the results have been somewhat consistent, if you like, but there are huge individual variations. And one of the reasons we find these big variations is because you can't just think about the individual. The individual does not exist in isolation from others. They are there. And so what we know from our own research that we've conducted in this space is that how well people adapt and perform is a complex interaction between them as an individual, the people around them, but also the people back home. Soon they're still having some contact, as well as the organisational culture. So it's about the individual, the relationship, and organisational factors. All three need to be taken into consideration if you're truly going to select for the optimal candidates in terms of their ability to succeed and to thrive. Now, putting all that aside, let's talk about, from an individual perspective, what tends to help. What are the fairly consistent findings that predict somebody who's going to be more likely to thrive in extreme environments like Antarctica? The number one factor that is reported time and time again is actually task ability. So in other words, can they do the job they've been employed to do? Can they do the job that they're in the extreme environment for? And this is twofold. One is the sense of confidence, trust, and achievement within the individual. I know I can do this. I know I can do it well. That sense of trust in the individual actually promotes psychological resilience and adaptation. It's a form of self-evaluation that needs to be in the positive. But it also starts to impact the organisational and the relationship factors that I flagged earlier as well. The people around you need to trust that you can do the job you need to do. Because if they don't have that trust, they become distressed. Either the partner or the family and friends back home become distressed, thinking, you're in a really high-risk environment. You're really not equipped for this. I can't stop worrying about you as a result. Or from the organisational perspective, the collegial perspective, you are part of this team. And if you can't do your part, potentially our whole objectives will fall down. So task ability is actually number one. Secondly is sociability. So in other words, can you get along with other people? Now, you think, well, inherently they need to be able to. They can't escape them. You know, it's the same people all the time. They've got to be really social. Yes, that's true to an extent. What we do know is that People who thrive in extreme environments are those who are kind of middle of the road, if you like. They definitely have good social skills, they can engage with others, they can be collaborative, but they also need to be able to have time on their own. They need to be able to deal with the quiet. They need to be able to deal with not constantly engaging in social interactions. And that's really important, because if somebody, is highly, highly extroverted, that means that individual gets their energy from being around others. They are energized and motivated by that interaction with others. Now, if you can imagine being on station anywhere from 9 to 12 months and having a highly extroverted person who always wants to be talking to you, always wants to be spending time with you, always wants to be engaged in activities that will stimulate their mind and their needs. If you're not similarly as extroverted, you're going to find that quite hard and you're going to experience tensions and frustrations. But also, if that individual looks around and tries to seek out that engagement with others and there's no one available, that person's going to become distressed because they're not going to have their internal needs met either. The third ability is emotional stability. So essentially what that means is, because of the extreme psychological demands that are placed on people working in extreme and unusual environments, we know that if people have lower levels of mental health entering this space, they are much more likely to experience psychological stress. Similarly, we know if people already have difficulties with their thinking, with their decision making, with their sleep, these are all going to be exacerbated. So starting from a place of relatively sound emotional stability gives people a bit of a buffer zone to move up and move down, as the case may be. So bearing that in mind, I thought it might be interesting for you to have a bit of a think about whether you've got the right stuff to work in an extreme and unusual environment like Antarctica. So I want you to just have a look at the list of items that's on the screen at the moment. And for each one, just mentally or on a bit of paper or on your phone if you want to, if you had to rate yourself from 1, this does not describe me at all, up to 5, that is absolutely 100% me, what sort of number would you give yourself? So just have a look through that list, take a couple of moments, and then I'll bring you back to have a bit of a discussion about what it all means. As you may have gathered already from some of my comments so far, in terms of the level of extroversion, we're really looking for someone with moderate levels of extroversion, which is that first line up the top there, as well as low to moderate levels of introversion, which is the reserved, quiet stage. And the reason we want those moderate levels is it means there's much more flexibility for these individuals to adapt to different social demands. In terms of your criticalness, whether you're prone to perhaps being a little more quarrelsome or being, if you like, sympathetic and warm, this is a measure of agreeableness. So in other words, how likely it is you are to go with the flow or perhaps just stand your ground. Again, we actually want you to be about middle of the range here, because there will always be occasions where you do need to actually confront an issue, particularly if it's around safety and well-being. But there might be other times where you need to be able to let go of things, even if it's annoyed you, even if it's frustrated you. You're really not going to gain anything by pursuing it. So we want you to be about middle of the road there as well. When it comes to being dependable and self-disciplined versus disorganised or even careless, I know this might seem like an easy one, and you'd be thinking, well, obviously you need to be really disciplined. You really need to be dependable. Well, yes, But one of the hallmarks of working in Antarctica is something we call the A factor, which is essentially, Antarctica getting in the way. It's, if you like, it's like the Antarctic version of Murphy's Law. And so what often happens is you will have a particular task or a particular project that you're working on, and perhaps some of the equipment fails and you don't have a backup, or the parts haven't been delivered yet, or due to weather, it's actually no longer feasible to pursue that particular project anymore. What we know is people who are highly, highly self-disciplined and dependable, so, we call this, if you like, conscientious. If you're too conscientious, you actually experience quite high levels of distress because your brain will interpret that as you being blocked from achieving your goals. In contrast, of course, we don't want you really, really low in conscientiousness either, because nothing will get done. And again, that huge risk factor of the environment itself means that you pose a risk to everyone else there. So again, we're looking for that middle of the road, maybe sort of moderate to high conscientiousness. So moderate levels of extroversion, moderate levels of agreeableness, moderate to high levels of conscientiousness. The next one is an openness to experience. And that's contrasted with, if you like, conventionalism. Now, again, if you think about it, Antarctica is a pretty rugged place. You're definitely stepping outside your comfort zone to go there. So you do need to have an openness and be seeking out new experiences and new things. But again, we don't want this to be too high. The reason being that often there will be times where that will feel quite stifled. So again, particularly during winter, when all the physical hazards of the environment, the volume basically gets dialed right up to 100%, there's much fewer opportunity to get off station because of those safety risks. So if you have too much of a drive for adventure, too much of a need for new experiences, that feeling contained and constrained can be really quite negative. So we're again looking for that moderate level of openness to new experience. And when we think about things like being a somewhat anxious person versus a more calm person, we're really looking at emotional stability. And we actually want high levels of emotional stability. So for those of you who have familiarity with some of the broader personality theories, you'll probably hear some little bells ringing saying, oh, hang on a minute, that links to the big 5 personality, of openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and emotional stability. Now, you'll note that we don't use the term neuroticism anymore, and that's because it's so highly stigmatized and its actual meaning has become quite distorted. So we talk about emotional stability as the opposite to that. And again, you'll be seeing some parallels here to experiences of isolation and confinement associated with pandemic mitigation strategies. Those individuals who are highly, highly extroverted have really, really seen some very large impacts on their mental health and wellbeing, similar to those with lower levels of emotional stability. And the data coming out is very consistent with what we've seen in other extreme environments, which is those with lower levels of emotional stability before experiencing isolation experience much higher levels of distress that are sustained for much longer because of the impacts of their experience. So bearing all this in mind, how, given it's such a risky environment, if there are so many challenges, how do we figure out what's normal versus what's not normal in terms of reactions? So this is when I talk about normal reactions to an abnormal environment, i.e. an extreme environment, versus abnormal reactions to the abnormal environment. So in other words, you're supposed to have a reaction. This is not your normal everyday experience. And actually, if you had no reaction at all, I'd be really worried, because it suggests you're not processing the information on some level. So typically speaking, and again, if you look at these, there's going to be a lot of parallels with the pandemic. Number one of the largest, most frequently endorsed normal reactions to an abnormal environment is an altered sleep-wake cycle. Now, in Antarctica, that's at least partially because of the light-dark cycles. Remember, during austral summer, there's almost 24-hour daylight, winter, almost zero daylight. So that has an impact on people's circadian rhythms, which is basically your internal body clock. It affects when you sleep, it affects your bowel functions, it affects your hormone secretions, all of those things. But the other reason we see an altered sleep-wake cycle is because the impacts of cognitive load. So whenever we go into a new environment, it actually places more demands on our brain, because our brain, it's always looking for shortcuts, okay? And that's because there's so much going on in the world. It can't physically go through every piece of information. So when the world's predictable, we feel pretty in control, and we've got a little bit more wiggle room to deal with new information or unforeseen circumstances. But when the world is not predictable, then we're having to actually spend more time, more energy on making sense of the world around us. And when we're using more of that energy, more of that mental energy, more of that emotion regulation energy, it does impact our ability to sleep in two main ways. One is people actually have trouble getting to sleep because their brain's still going tick, 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 trying to make sense of what's going on. And the reason that tends to happen most at night is because many of the distractions that keep you busy during the day are gone. You know, you're lying in bed on your own. There's nothing to drown out those thoughts. That's actually juxtaposed with needing more sleep because of the amount of work that your brain is doing. So you have this cycle where people are having difficulty sleeping and feeling chronically exhausted because of the demands placed on their brain. And because of that cognitive load issue, we're going to see altered cognition. So it's basically altered thought patterns and brain function. Essentially, your memory, not going to be as good. Your attention, also not as good. Your concentration, also not as good. And your decision-making. This also seems much more difficult. It seems to take you longer to figure things out and then to act on them. And again, we're definitely seeing that in the pandemic. In Antarctica, we do see a bit of somatising as well. And what that means is when you are under incredible pressure in terms of stress, in terms of cognitive load, what sometimes happens is that your body reacts physically. So, for example, you might get really tense and you might strain muscles because of that physiological tension. It can sometimes even be your body going, hey, you're not listening to your brain. You're not being very nice right now. I'm going to force you to slow down because of pain. I'm going to force you to take care of yourself. So the important thing here is this is not faking. This is a genuine, normally pain experienced because of psychological pressures. In the very early days when we started looking at the psychology of extreme environments, remembering we've only been doing this from really the late 50s, and it really didn't start to gain momentum until at least the 90s. So it's really early science here. But if you look at some of the early data from the late 50s, thinking about the cultures of white Western people who were employed at the time, there was also stigma around mental health. So there was a degree of, knowingly or otherwise, it is much more acceptable for me to have an injury and take time out for a physical injury than for me to acknowledge that I'm under pressure right now. Particularly if there was a fear, you'd never go back to Antarctica again if you couldn't mentally come. You will miss loved ones, and people do all the time. And that's really exacerbated around birthdays and other celebrations, which again in the pandemic we're seeing that really hits home. And also deaths of loved ones. So we know that the data is really clear that when the pandemic first broke and news was filtering to people in Antarctica, there was a sense of unreality. But also, many people who go to Antarctica are aware that particularly elderly friends and relatives may not be alive when they return. But for the first time, there was actually a reality that otherwise healthy, young people that they loved also might not be there when they return. And so it's not surprising that there will be days where people just want to leave, they just want to go home. And that doesn't mean that they don't want to be there, full stop. It's just that sometimes they want to break. And we do see mood fluctuations. It's not seen in everyday life, but we do see them particularly in extreme environments. And historically, we try to map those to try and predict when are those times where people are most likely to show those mood fluctuations. And the reason we wanted to know this is so, well, if we know when the mood fluctuations are going to happen, we can put more supports in place, either just before or during, to try and bolster people back up. Now, originally, there was this theory of something called the third quarter phenomenon. And that basically suggested that once you hit the 3/4 mark of your stay, doesn't matter how long you're there, hit that 3/4 mark and your mood's going to plummet because it's been more than halfway there and there's still so long to go before you get to leave. So it was really premised on this idea of hopelessness and helplessness. However, myself and a research student, Claire Hawkes, recently conferred her PhD, so Dr. Claire Hawkes now, also shows that when you look at mood fluctuations in Antarctic expeditioners, it's actually much more wave-like, and that's the image I have on the screen for you at the moment. It's up and down and up and down. So instead of being a really clear, bang, 3/4, it's all going to go, off the rails, we've actually got a really interesting pattern. And there's a couple of things I want to point out. So in this particular diagram, the higher the point means the higher level of distress. So when people first get there, they're pretty happy. Things are going pretty well. And when you think about that, they're busy and there's this sense of finally I've made it. Once they kind of get into the groove of things, we see this gradual increase in distress. It's not clinically significant distress. It's not a diagnosable mental health condition. For want of a better word, it's just stress. Then around midwinter, it drops off again. People kind of resign to this is my lot. But here's the really interesting thing. The closer people get to returning home, the more their distress goes up. And we're seeing the same thing with people coming out of prolonged isolations in the pandemic. And most of this anxiety is not just around safety, but actually more about, I don't know how to manage this new society. The rules have changed. What can I do? So this is where our data that we've been collecting for about 10 years now is really starting to inform how we can proactively prepare people to transition back. Because if we aren't supporting them or if they experience particular difficulties, we're going to see these things in the screen right now. So really, really slow cognitive processing to the point where it impacts your ability to do your job, really low mood that doesn't seem to shift. And in some really, really extreme cases, we do see delusions and hallucinations in people who don't have a history of psychosis. Now, there's a couple of things, and I'm not going to labour these points because it's really just a bit of a heads up, if you like. But our research has consistently shown that the best predictors of how well people reintegrate after isolation and confinement are actually not what happened during the time at all. It's actually how well you were individually, socially, and organisationally before the isolation. But even more importantly, what was going on when you came back in. And that's actually really exciting because we can't change what was going on before isolation. We can't change what happened during isolation. But we have a lot of capacity to change what happens as you're coming out of isolation. And so this is where we're really excited to be able to apply our findings, not just to people in Antarctica and other extreme environments, but our current extreme environment of the pandemic. So we've talked about the fact that on the ice, there are challenges. We know this. One point I would like to draw out is that there's some really, really interesting data that shows it's actually quite healthy for people on station to be frustrated and to externalise those frustrations to head office, people back at the Australian Antarctic Division head office. The reason being that helps to protect the station dynamic. And this is what we're seeing to a degree with people who've experienced repeated and prolonged isolation in quarantines because of the pandemic. If they can externalise their frustrations outside their home, that's actually going to protect the people in that bubble with them. Because otherwise what happens is those tensions and those frictions can undermine the social relationships, which they really need to protect their health and well-being. So fundamentally, one big message I have at this point that I really want people to take away with them is that what happens when people leave, when they start coming back into the more routine environment, actually defines how much they will adapt and grow as a result of their experience. And what our data shows, and we have data, so another one of the research students I've had the pleasure of working with, Samantha Blythe, she and I actually have data that shows the longer the time post-isolation, the more growth people demonstrate. I'm just going to, there we go. This is some data we've published that actually shows between 2 years and beyond 2 years post-return, these are the types of growth outcomes people experience as a result of being in isolation. And repeatedly, it doesn't matter if you are male, female, or non-binary, if you're single or partnered, if you're older or younger, if you've been in Antarctica for longer or lesser amounts of time, this pattern holds up. People have increased sense of self-reliance, they've got new interests, they've found new opportunities. And that's what we're seeing with the pandemic, where people are talking about an increased awareness of their values and making life decisions that actually help them better align their behaviours with those life decisions. So just because this was slightly out of order, I'm just going to flick back for a moment. So my apologies, I'm not trying to give you motion sickness. The big messages we have are that when we talk about people's well-being and performance and return from an extreme environment, isolation, confinement, that functioning is actually more about what happens afterwards rather than what happened during. And that's a message of hope. That's not meant to suggest that it doesn't matter how hard it was, it'll be fine. It's about saying we know it's hard, but that doesn't have to define everything that goes on from here. There tends to be a bit of a post-honeymoon slump. So in other words, there tends to be a bit of a peak in well-being immediately after being released from isolation, but then kind of, the real world starts happening again, and we kind of have a bit of a space. But if we use coping strategies, particularly those social relationships, this is what's going to help people adapt. So we need people to think flexibly. In other words, there's never just one way to think about a situation. We know that humour is a very powerful predictor of positive adaptation. And in some of our studies, it's been shown that humour by itself can predict up to 30% of how well people adapt post-isolation. So find time to have a laugh, because it's definitely not all bad. Post-experience growth is actually the most common outcome following an extreme and unusual environment, primarily related to personal strength and new possibilities. And that this post-experience growth may not be immediately obvious, but is definitely there. So with that, I will finish up and hope that you've been able to take something away whereby these lessons we've learned from Antarctica and continue to learn are so, so very valuable to us beyond the ice.
Now we have time for questions, and we may have some from online.
Do women have more trouble than the men?
That's a very interesting question. Our data actually shows the opposite. Our data shows that during pre-departure and during time on the ice, people who identify as female do experience higher levels of distress, but upon return, that distress drops lower than people who identify as male. Really interestingly, though, is that if you compare the expeditioner, so the person who's been in Antarctica, with their partner, it's the partner who actually has higher distress at all times until the expeditioner comes home, and then the expeditioner's distress goes up and the partner's distress goes down. Now, a little caveat around that. At the moment, the majority of expeditioners remain people who identify as male, and the majority of the partners we've had the pleasure of working with in our research identify as female. So it might be that some of those differences you're interested in, we're just not capturing because there's just not as many people to work with and learn from.
You mentioned that there's an existing body of research and literature broadly on this sort of topic. One thing that's different about what you're doing is you've got a rather unusual profile of subjects. These aren't just a nice random sample of the population. They're a pretty peculiar sample of the population. So I wonder if there are any differences there that would limit the extent to which what you've discovered in that particular environment with those particular people might translate to other extreme environments, like the one that was going through my mind was prison.
Yes, thank you. That is a very, very important observation and definitely a limitation of our existing data set. We do know that if you take Antarctic expeditioners and you measure them on a whole range of psychological factors, they are consistently different from a random sample from the rest of the population. And we have published around this. So what you're alluding to is very important for a couple of reasons. One, it means that we can't simply compare our Antarctic data to other populations and assume that any differences are because of an experience, but instead that it's probably because they're a different group of people. And in regards to your comments around prison populations, I also do work in this space, and you are right, it's a very, very different experience, and one of the primary differences relates to perceptions of the experience. So people in Antarctica are often viewed with a bit of awe and excitement, whereas often people released from prison are experiencing stigma, shame, and other forms of negative social impacts, which means it's a very, very different experience.
Hi, I'm just wondering about the Navy crews in nuclear submarines who have to go out on 6-month patrols around the world, you know, and how do they cope? Is the same principle involved here?
Again, a really good example of what we call an analogue environment. So in other words, it's got some very strong parallels with the experience of Antarctic expeditioners. We do find some similarities between their experiences and what we see in the Antarctic populations, but there are some important differences. One of the main important differences is that the majority of crew on submarines actually have that overarching organisational culture of the Navy, for example, that has a collective sense of identity. They tend to have long periods of time where they get to meet and get to know one another, and there's a sense of connection. We don't get the same degree of connection with Antarctic personnel, who often will remain affiliated with other organisations whilst working in Antarctica. So there are some parallels in terms of isolation and confinement, but when it comes to adapting back to a more normal environment, people in submarines tend to actually have much shorter periods of time to adapt before they have to go away again. And they also tend to have a pre-existing social connection to go back into, i.e. the Navy. Whereas Antarctic expeditioners often come back to Hobart, sometimes Fremantle, and what will happen is they essentially disperse and they don't have that same opportunity to keep connected and that sense of identity. So yes, there are some important learnings around what happens while they're away, but when they come back, there are some important differences that mean we have to understand the differences between those populations.
I'm coming into a shorter term, similar experience perhaps. Do you find parallels for fly-in, fly-out workers where it's 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 4 weeks on, 2 weeks off or whatever?
Absolutely. There are definitely parallels with fly-in, fly-out workers. One of the big differences we see is that fly-in, fly-out workers, once they develop a routine for adapting back to the normal world, they are much, much more efficient at doing so. So our data actually shows that with Antarctic expeditioners, it can actually take up to 12 months after they've come back for them to kind of feel that they're back in a routine, that they feel kind of, for want of a better term, back to their normal self. In contrast, FIFO workers don't have that period of time to process information, to recover, to develop new strategies. So what we find is that in the early stages of their career, fly-in, fly-out workers have much higher levels of distress, much higher levels of relationship breakdown, and more difficulties adapting until they find, if you like, that secret formula that allows them to shift in and shift out. And there's some really interesting research at the moment that's starting to draw parallels between fly-in, fly-out workers and some other experiences where, for example, flight personnel or even children who live between different home environments for various reasons, as soon as they've got a routine, so essentially as soon as their brain says the world is predictable, the world is safe, they adapt much better. But until then, they are at much higher risk of distress, and that's why we do see particularly high levels of psychological distress in FIFO populations and why there's a lot of focus on supporting them.
Hi, thank you. That was so interesting. I just wanted to ask about one of the slides. There was a term that may have related to what you talked about, this kind of paradoxical phenomenon of the ups and the downs in stress levels between the partner and the person returning. And it was something like letdown. You might need to look at, I don't know, I can't remember what the term was exactly. It was on one of the slides about one of the possible experiences of people when they come back.
Sure. So that was letdown phenomenon, and it's much more clearly documented in Antarctic expeditioners, but we also do see it in their partners. And essentially, it's a psychological term for a specific form of grief. So in other words, if you like, you've been riding this bit of a high of, I'm working in Antarctica, I'm doing something that most other people in the world will never get to do. And for a lot of people, this time in Antarctica actually represents the pinnacle of their career. They've been working towards this for years and years before they go. So they're riding this wave of, this is it, this is where I want to be. And when they come back into a more routine environment, there's kind of this sense of, okay, what now? Things aren't as exciting. And there's a sense of loss. I've lost part of who I am, I've lost excitement, and now what do I do? So that's that letdown phenomenon, form of grief. In the partner experience, it doesn't seem to be as pronounced, but what tends to happen is there is a build-up of an expectation when the expeditioner comes home, we'll do this and we'll do that, and all of these wonderful things will happen. And what tends to happen is after a little bit of a honeymoon phase where there's almost kind of tiptoeing around each other and the realities start to set in, there can be a disappointment that the expeditioner is not focusing enough time, attention, or resources on the partner. And the partner can have a level of grief that, I supported you the whole time you were away. I kept everything going at home. I was working on top of that, or looking after our children, or providing care to our relatives, whatever the case may be. And you've come back, and now it's my turn to have a bit of rest or have a sense of achievement. And that's where their grief can come in. So letdown phenomenon is a fairly well-documented experience, although often that term might not be used.
I'm interested in the body environment, hot and cold and things like that. The study of how the human body works under those kind of conditions for a prolonged time. Is a study been done on that? Or I guess there would have been. What is the ideal body environment for working in those conditions?
Again, a wonderful question, not least because it gives me the opportunity to again emphasise that mind-body connection. If you're working in temperatures that are too hot or too cold, your brain function is negatively impacted. So in the Australian Antarctic program, within the buildings that they have on the relative stations, they maintain a constant temperature of around 22 degrees. So the idea is that it's comfortable. You can wear clothes that are comfortable, you can feel relaxed, but it's not going to be too warm that you overheat and not so cold that you're spending energy on trying to keep warm. So we do know around 22 degrees seems to be optimal for this particular group of people. We also know, however, that there are impacts of oxygen levels. So more so than the body temperatures, we've been doing some research around the impacts of more or less oxygen availability on people's health and performance. And we're trying to find at what level is your cognition, so again, your thinking, your decision-making, those types of things. At what level of oxygen does that start to be compromised? Because remember, Antarctica is a very, very elevated continent. So the minute you start going up on mountains or landing in higher plateaus, you've actually got less oxygen in the air. So at the moment, there is a lot of research being done on the impacts of low oxygen on decision-making.
Middle.
Okay. Do you prepare young people wanting to work in Antarctica with a psychological questionnaire to help them before they officially apply? In other words, they might realise that they may not be suitable and they get further down the track.
So I have the privilege of working quite closely with the Australian Antarctic Division. So what I'm very aware of their selection processes, and a very big part of the selection process is there is a full psychological assessment that occurs, not just questionnaires, but a range of interviews and other forms of assessment. And during those experiences, it is made very, very clear to people, here is the reality. So trying to make sure it's not being romanticised in their mind and they understand fully what they're going to be exposed to. I don't become directly involved in that particular part. The reason being, I actually am the consultant clinical psychologist to the Australian Antarctic program. So what that means is if people become distressed or otherwise needing advanced support while they're in Antarctica, I'm the person who provides that psychological support. So I can't be involved in their selection because I may be involved in any further treatment. Having said that, I've worked quite extensively with the Polar Medicine Unit and with the organisational psychologist at the Australian Antarctic Division to make sure that the information resources and all of those things that basically, do I really want to go down there, are based on the research findings we have.
What are the implications for the Mars expedition?
This is actually something I'm working on at the moment. So our data is the only data at the moment that considers the goes beyond the individual. So most other research we have done more broadly in this space is much more about the individual, whereas our research looks at the individual, their social relationships, and the organisation. And so at the moment, I have the privilege of working with NASA, and I'm working with the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, as well as the Australian Space Agency, in developing psychological countermeasures to support successful adaptation to Mars missions, particularly considering there will be a point where people don't return from Mars, that they continue to inhabit that space. So understanding how that affects their psychological adaptation and performance, as well as the people left behind, is a very big focus at the moment, and it's something we're continuing to investigate.
Hi, I was wondering if there was any sort of training that you find helps people deal with it better. Like if we're working in group situations, we often have group rules and guidelines, and at work there's professionalism, whereas when you're at home, maybe the gloves are off a bit more. So it doesn't, is there some sort of training or guidelines that helps with that?
Absolutely. There's a really, really extensive pre-departure training program for all who are employed within the Australian Antarctic program and go to Antarctica. And that program spans a range of conflict resolution, respectful behaviour, professional boundaries, in addition to many other factors. And alongside that program, there are opportunities to try and build that sense of identity and connection we talked about earlier. So that is actually part of the pre-departure training program. While people are at Antarctica, there is a very strict code of conduct. They are government employees, they must abide by that. And even in the downtime, like you said, often a time when people let hair down a little bit more, relax a little bit more, there are still minimum behavioural standards required. And I think one of the challenges for leaders in Antarctica, and where I really respect the work that they and the division do, is equipping leaders to support people should a situation arise where perhaps those minimum behaviour standards aren't met. And there's an opportunity to provide support and to help that person to engage in different ways going forward. So it's a very big focus of the division, and I think increasingly so as we go forward, they are spending a lot more time focusing on creating that space where people can thrive both personally as well as professionally.
Well, Professor Norris, thank you for a delightful presentation and for fielding those questions.